Somebody asked me about BLM, Bureau of Land Management, the cattle ranchers issue. Let's talk about that for a bit. I thought I was going to talk to Stefan about that today, and it's the only thing we didn't get to, which is a bit of a shock. Because that's kind of what I thought the interview was about. So, yeah, it turns out I'm a little ammoed up for that. A guy I know named Sean, just earlier today, sent me a link to somebody, and he said, have you heard of this woman? She's the female you. She does what you do. And I said, oh, okay, well, that'd be interesting. And so he sent me a link. This was before the interview, by happy coincidence. And her name is Chris Ann Hall. I don't know if anybody's seen any of her videos. So let's talk about Bureau of Land Management for a good long time here, because I think it's a hot topic. I'll probably do my next afterburner about that. Look, I know the basics, but I certainly understand the Constitution, and maybe on some level I understand the Constitution better than constitutional lawyers. I think I understand it morally better than they do, or on some level, maybe at least from a storytelling point of view. But I certainly don't understand the Constitution the way a good constitutional lawyer does, and especially somebody who not only understands the Constitution, but likes it. This president used to teach constitutional law, but he taught it in such a way when he was being interviewed prior to taking office. He talked about the problem with the Constitution is there's so many constraining powers. They prevent the government from doing all the stuff that we would really like to do. And he clearly said this. There's not any question about it. He said it as if he said it's a problem. It's a problem. The problem is the Constitution limits the power of the government. That's the problem. So that's how this thing got elected. He knows what he's doing, and he knows why he's doing it. He's just on their side. He's not on the Constitution side. He's on the other side. So anyway, right around noon today, I saw a video from my first time I ever saw one of her videos, a woman named Chris Ann Hall, and she's a constitutional lawyer down in Florida. She went to the University of Florida, so we know that she's got integrity and class and high intelligence. I think it's a given. So she did a video on the situation up in Oregon. Now, I had heard some things about the people up in Oregon. I'd heard the original story about the family. I heard about them burning land to protect their land, and some of the land that got burned was federal land. And then I heard about the prison sentences, and they were supposed to get 5 years, and one got a year, and the other got 6 months or 5 months or something. And then after they came out, they wanted to put him back in jail again for the 5 years. So I understood all of that, and I understood the provocative nature of what the government was doing. I'd interviewed Dinesh D'Souza, who was also given an extraordinary, forget about the severity of it, just looking at it statistically. What happened to Dinesh D'Souza was he was given an unheard of punishment for the crime he committed, which was a minor crime. He got an unheard of punishment because the Justice Department wanted to get him because he made fun of the president. So when I hear that these guys are, rising up on their hind legs up in Oregon like actual patriots, I understand that the prosecution of these brothers has been not only abnormal but provocative, and that the federal government's out of control. And I had all these arguments lined up, and then I also heard arguments about, these guys may not be exactly the kind of people you want to make maybe these are the guys you want to make your stand behind. That there's a lot of kind of gray area, and some of these guys are pretty iffy, and there's a bunch of racial supremacists up there, and so on and so forth. And I just I don't know what to do. I mean, I've got an opinion on it, and my opinion at the time prior to seeing this video was the kind of weird conundrum that the Oregon situation puts me in personally, and I guess some of you this way too, in the sense that looking at it without getting into the constitutional issue, you can basically say it this way. These guys were provoked. The federal government overreached. The federal government was unjust. The federal government was way out of bounds, which is all unusual. The federal government prosecuted these guys. Now the pundits, the liberal pundits, are screaming for them to be executed, basically just drop an A-bomb on these guys, because the idea of armed civilians carrying American flags and Gadsden flags and talking about the Constitution terrifies the left more than anything. This is where they're tender. This is what scares them to the quick. They're not afraid of Al Qaeda or ISIS because they don't run into Al Qaeda or ISIS. They're not afraid of them because they're not here. But the one thing they fear more than anything, this is what happens in Oregon right now for the left, is what a slave uprising is for a slave master on the plantations. And the great fear of the slave owners in the Confederacy, the reason all of those laws were in existence, the reason for all the cruelty, the reason for the whips, the reason for the dogs, the reason for the lynching, the reason for all of the Jim Crow laws, the reason for all of this, just all the slander, the reason for all of the intimidation, the Klan, the burning crosses, all of it. It's all the same. They're there to keep black Americans terrified. And as long as they could be kept terrified, they could be kept subservient. They could be kept under their thumb. And that's what the Confederate slave owners and the people in the Deep South feared, was they feared the slave uprising. They feared that these black people would rise up in the middle of the night and kill them because they outnumbered them so greatly. And everything was based on that, all of it. So now the question is, the left feels that way about these uprisings. The idea of armed American citizens standing up for their constitutional rights terrifies them. That's why they're going ballistic. That's why they're losing their minds. Montel Williams basically go in there and assassinate these people, just gun them down. So, okay. So the question is, all of this stuff makes sense, right? And all of this stuff is kind of pro rancher stuff, all of it, and I mean it all. And I don't intend to walk back from any of it. The only thing in this mix that makes it an interesting subject and complicates it for me is these guys are breaking the law. They're breaking the law, and so that's where the question is. I mean, we still respect the law, and the thing about this that's so appalling to me is that Occupy Wall Street broke the law. You'd have a Tea Party event, people would get their own permits, buy their own porta potties, hire the extra police, and so on, and they'd leave the place cleaner when they found it. So Tea Party protests are legal protests. Occupy Wall Street was not only illegal in terms of the protest being illegal, but Occupy Wall Street people would simply smash cars and they'd defecate on doorsteps and they'd break windows and they'd burn buildings, and nobody did a thing. Nobody said boo. This is a legitimate civil rights action. These people have a legitimate case, and this is just the righteous anger of the people. And after Occupy Wall Street fizzled, they had to restart the whole thing. It's the same basic crowd with Black Lives Matter crowd. It's basically street thuggery. It's basically lawlessness. It's basically the ability to go into a town and riot it and burn it to the ground without consequences. Not only without consequences, knowing full well that the president and the Justice Department are on your side. Smash everything up, because as long as we keep smashing everything up, then the people who own these businesses and pay the taxes are going to be intimidated, and they'll give us what we want. So to hear these guys being demonized after 5 years of Occupy Wall Street and 3 years of Black Lives Matter, when these people are just rioting on the streets, committing all these crimes on a daily basis, the idea that now suddenly we have to bring out the army and attack helicopters to kill 150 people who've never fired on anybody, they've never destroyed any property, they've never hurt anybody, they've never done anything like that, is appalling. And what's more appalling is that ultimately, when you get right down to it, it's still against the law. And this is where the issue falls for many of us. They've put two competing high value moral imperatives on the scale, and they're asking people like me to decide which one is more important to you, obeying the law, or is there something about this where now you've been a law and order guy your whole life, now we're calling, no, it's okay to break the law. So, I think my answer to this would be this. I think there's cause for an actual revolution against the federal government. I'm going to get to what this woman said in this video of hers. But it's either on or it's off, right? I mean, that's really, I kind of think that's the practical answer I have right now. It's either on or it's off. And it's not on. So, where do you go? I mean, either the government is declared to be lawless by a huge number of the American people, and the revolution is on, where the social compact is irrevocably broken. There is no more redress for grievances, no more legal redress for grievances. And since there's no more legal redress for grievances, and since there is no longer any way to have your voice heard in this so-called democracy, then the government is lawless, and then all bets are off. Now, if that happened, I know which side I'd be on, but that isn't this. This is not that. And so it's kind of like, well, are we in rebellion against the law, yes or no? And we're not. The country is not in rebellion against the law. So my feeling would be, my measured feeling, I hate to have to come down with a kind of a legalistic kind of a take on this, but that's where it puts me. My legalistic sort of trying to parse out my moral position on this is, while I think their action is not only justified, and certainly more justified than the Occupy Wall Street people, and while they haven't committed any harm, and while they haven't done any of the things that these other groups that went away scot-free did, I still think they're breaking the law. And that bothers me. It puts me in a tough spot. Now, as I said, all of this was where I was before I saw this video. As I said, the person who did it was named Chris Ann Hall, and she's got a video on Oregon with about 100, high hundreds, maybe 200,000 views when I saw it earlier today. And then finally we got to the real issue here. And this is why it's great to have somebody who really understands the Constitution, and I mean every aspect of it, like my friend Scott Ott, who's here. And Scotty, I'm sorry I had to move the show to Thursday. I hope I didn't step on your show. Now we talk about what does the Constitution say. And as I learned from this extraordinary gator, a constitutional attorney and patriot she really made it clear. She said it's not about the ranchers. The story's not about the ranchers. The story's not about the family. It's not about the right or wrong of that family. It's not about occupying the post. It's not about any of that. That's not what this is about. I said, okay, I'm listening. And basically she said, let's look at what the Constitution says. And what she said was, look at Article 1, Section 8. These are the enumerated powers of the Congress. And look at Clause 17. And basically Clause 17 said that as far as federal land is concerned, Clause 17 says that the District of Columbia can have 10 square miles of land if the state cede it to have a federal district called the District of Columbia. That's authorized by the Constitution, but no greater than 10 square miles. And also the Constitution with the permission of the states. And the permission of the states has to be ongoing. If the states withdraw the permission, then these have to go away. The permission of the states is also granted for what she called forts and ports. But basically, if you read the actual language, it says things like dockyards, armories, arsenals, forts, and so on. But forts and ports is pretty good. Basically, what they're saying is that the federal government does, in fact, have a claim to land to set up forts, to defend the country. Things like arsenals. There's a clear constitutional allowance for. And the Constitution says the building. It doesn't say the land, it says a building. You can have a building for an arsenal or a building or a set of buildings for a port. But these need to be granted by the states. The states have the power. And as Chris Ann went on to point out, which is something I never really quite really fully realized. I mean, it's one of these things I knew, but it's not one of these things I'd fully felt. She said, when we talk about the Constitution, we always talk about the people, that it's an agreement between the people and the government, but it's not. What it really is, when you really get down to brass tacks, the Constitution is a legal contract between the states and the federal government. That's what it is. And I thought I don't know if I would call it a profound insight. It's just something that penetrated the dimness up here and got through. It is. And so in terms of the land that the federal government can own, it's clearly stated that the federal government can own the District of Columbia so long as it remains less than 10 square miles and may own the buildings and obviously the land underneath it for forts and ports, basically. And that's all. And that's it. And the forts and ports part, they have to have the ongoing permission of the states. And if the state of Nevada says, oh, well, you can put a fort in here, and then 50 years later or 5 minutes later, state of Nevada changes its mind and says, you know what, we've decided we don't want you to here, then they have to leave. So I wish I had the sense to bring this graphic, but we're taking these questions on the fly. I should have had it. I'll have it eventually. I don't know if you guys have seen the graphic of federal land ownership west of the Mississippi, but federal land ownership is red, and the 3 or 4 states closest to the Pacific coast are almost all red. It's shocking. Nevada is, 80-90% owned by the federal government? Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon, parts of Oregon, Washington State. It's amazing how much land the federal government owns. And Chris Ann Hall's point is it doesn't have the right to own any of it. The Bureau of Land Management, these people are facing off against, is an illegal organization. In fact, you can make the case that the EPA is not authorized by the Constitution, and it's certainly not, neither is the Department of Transportation or the Department of Energy, Health and Human Services. None of them are authorized by the Constitution. They all need to go away. Doesn't mean that the work that they do needs to go away. It needs to be handled by the states, and they would do it a lot more effectively, or the people who do it even more effectively. But this ownership of a third of the country by the federal government is a little bit stepping outside the boundaries of 10 square miles and forts and ports, right? Now, people have said this has been going on since Teddy Roosevelt's time or whatever, and then there's all these Supreme Court decisions validating this interpretation. And Chris Ann came to the same conclusion I came to when I was talking about the Commerce Clause. She doesn't care what the Supreme Court said about it, and I don't care either what the Supreme Court said. It doesn't matter. The Supreme Court is empowered by the Constitution, and so the Supreme Court does not get to rule against the Constitution. The rule of the Supreme Court does not supersede the Constitution because the Supreme Court's authority comes from the Constitution. When I was talking about the Commerce Clause, and people would say, well, there's all these historical precedents that the Supreme Court has said this was okay, and my response is, well, the Supreme Court is wrong. It's wrong. Well, are you a constitutional scholar? Are you a legal expert? No, I'm not. I'm actually not a legal expert or a constitutional scholar. I'm the guy who the Constitution was written for, directly. It was written for me. It was written for me as a citizen of this country, and the Constitution was written in clear, simple English sentences that could be understood by anybody. And so I'm one of those anybodies, and I can read a sentence. And when it comes to the Commerce Clause, it says the Congress shall have the power to regulate, not control, not to allow, but to regulate, to make even, commerce between the states, foreign powers, and the Indian tribes. So if you're not a state like Minnesota, if you're not a foreign power like Great Britain, if you're not an Indian tribe like the Navajo, the federal government has nothing to do with your commerce. They can't touch you. And if the Supreme Court ruled otherwise, the Supreme Court is wrong. It's wrong. It's clear sentence. There's nothing there that can be misunderstood. The federal government, the Constitution divides power between the federal government, called the United States, the states, and the people. And if they wanted the Commerce Clause to say that Congress can mess around with your commerce, then it would have said Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the people. It does not say that. It says specifically the opposite of that. So her point is these people, their grievance is immaterial. She was saying, and I think this is exactly the way to go, she was saying the grievance is immaterial because the entire thing is illegal. The whole thing out of the basket is illegal. The fact that there's a red dot visible from space is against the Constitution. They're not allowed to own that land. And that's where the argument is. And I think, wow, yeah, that clears up everything for me. That's wonderful. I don't have to worry about it anymore. I don't have to parse it anymore. I don't have to say, well, on the other hand, these guys are breaking the law. They're not breaking the law. They're not breaking the law. It's the government that's breaking the law. The fact that the Bureau for Land Management exists is a constitutional violation. It's breaking the law of the land. And it needs to stop. Now, the bigger question is, can this ever get back into the bottle? I don't know. That's a much more serious question. But that's really the issue, right? The Bureau of Land Management doesn't get to prosecute these people because not only, this is the point I was trying to make a second ago, you can say that the EPA or the Department of Transportation aren't authorized by the Constitution, and you'd be right, and they don't belong there. But they're not necessarily antithetical to the Constitution. In fact, what I'm trying to say is the EPA is not mentioned one way or another in the Constitution. So, since it's not mentioned, it should not have the power to exist. If you want an EPA, amend the Constitution, a federal EPA. But the Bureau of Land Management, on the other hand, is in direct contravention to the Constitution because the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 states pretty clearly that the government is prohibited from owning the land. Prohibited from it. So if the federal government's prohibited from owning the land, and these guys are having an argument with the branch of the federal government that is protecting land that it is not allowed to own in the first place, then that's where the argument is. And I thought, my God, that woman has got it exactly right. So I don't care about these guys. I don't care if they're racist. I don't care if they're Nazis. I don't care if they're progressives. I don't care if they're graphic art designers from San Francisco. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they are. It doesn't matter what they do. It matters that the Bureau of Land Management, who they're fighting against, is not only not authorized by the Constitution, it's specifically prohibited by the Constitution. And that's putting it a little more succinctly than she did, because I think I've just landed on it. This is why I like to do these topics before I go out and shoot them. the Bureau of Land Management is prohibited by the Constitution in a way that the EPA is not prohibited. It's just not authorized. EPA is not authorized. Department of Education is not authorized. The Department of Transportation is not authorized, and they should go. They don't belong there. But it's not prohibited. But this is prohibited by Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. And it's been prohibited for 100 years. So what the hell do we do about that? What do we do? I don't know. I saw a question I want to answer next, so it's been asked a couple times. Let's see if I can remember it. But this is where we need to be. This is where we need to be, and this is where we need to be fighting, and this is where we need to be arguing, right on this point, and just read it. Because look, there have been so many violations of the Constitution. In other words, look, I can make this as succinct as possible. I hope Scott's still watching because he's such a great expert on the Constitution and the founders. If you can, with impunity for 100 years, have a third of the country owned by the federal government when Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 specifically says they get 10 square miles plus forts and ports. If the Constitution can be violated in that way, then why can Barack Obama simply not stay for a third term? Why can he just not run for a third term? What's to prevent him from doing that? Well, it's against the Constitution. This is against the Constitution. It's been happening for 100 years, right? Why should a senator just serve 6 terms or a representative? Why can't a representative just stay in office? Just stay in office. I'm not leaving. What do you mean not leaving? You lost the election. I don't care. I'm not leaving. Well, the Constitution says you're limited to 2 terms. Yeah, but the Constitution also says that the federal government can own 10 square miles of land, and they own a third of the country. So my point is, does the Constitution law or not? Is it law or not? Because it's not 17 different constitutions, It's not like there's the Constitution for the land part, another Constitution for the Congress. It's one document. So, does it, yes or no? Is it law, yes or no? And if it is, then this all stuff needs to be sold to the public, and it needs to be sold or given to the public. They ought to sell it to the public at a very low rate, and you can raise a little money to pay off this debt that you're not authorized to run with all these other programs that are not authorized by the Constitution. So that was a real education for me, and it's great talking about people that know what they're talking about, because it just clarified things for me in a way that I'd never seen it clarified before, and really hadn't had much cause to think about this before. The other thing she mentioned, by the way, is that they apparently can reach, and if they reach, they can go to Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, which is about territories. And undoubtedly the same swine that would pervert the Commerce Clause in the same way. It says it can regulate commerce among the states, and people live in the states, so it can regulate interstate commerce. And if you live in a state, it can regulate the commerce. Don't you dare do this to me. I can read a sentence. But they're trying to say, well, there's a provision for the federal government being able to administer territories, and that's a pretty big territory we've got out west, so it's legal. Don't be ridiculous. When they talk about territories in the Constitution, we know what a territory is. A territory is a land that is not subject to the laws of the United States of America. That a territory is an official designation by the federal government for land that will eventually become a state, or more than one state. Louisiana Purchase was a territory, and it remained a territory until it was turned into the states that made up the Louisiana Purchase. So you don't get to call this. Well, we have a right to administer territory. Really? Well, it's not a territory. There's not the what would be a good word for this? There's not the territory of the Rockies that sits out there in the country that's unowned by anybody and is unmanaged by anybody. All of the land in question is not a territory that exists outside of the other states. All of this federally owned land is owned in the state of Colorado, which is illegal, owned in the state of New Mexico, which is illegal, owned in the state of Washington State, which is illegal, owned in the state of every state, which is illegal. It's all illegal. It's got to go. Got to go. And I think we started the show off by saying this is going to be a heck of an interesting year. I think somebody ought to make the case, if we just did to the Constitution what was written for, we'd all be a lot happier, and then there would be a set of laws that we can all behave by, and if we violate those laws, we can go to jail for it. We don't get to enforce some of it because we're Republicans, and then other parts of it we're going to ignore, and then we don't get to have progressives who enforce part of it, and other parts they ignore and violate. No, it's the law. And if you want to change the law, there's a way to change the law, and the way to change the law is to modify the Constitution. Great. If you want to say that the federal government can own a third of the country, then pass the 28th Amendment saying that this amendment hereby overturns Article 1, Section 8, Clause 13 of the Constitution and allows the federal government to buy whatever land they want to. Piece of cake, nothing to it. You probably could even get that passed. But that's not what the case is. And so this is where I start really realizing just how far gone we are and how deep the trouble we are in. When I found out about that, I never knew that. I just didn't know. I'd known that the federal government owned all this land for 100 years. I didn't know it was illegal. I had no idea until this afternoon. I had never read Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. I'd read it. I just didn't understand it. It's that great line from A Fish Called Wanda where he's talking to Kevin Kline and she accuses him of being an idiot. And Kevin Kline says, aha, well, she says, you're just an ape. You're just an ape. And he says, aha, well, does an ape read philosophy? And she says, yes, he reads it. He just doesn't understand it. And that's pretty much it. So as far as I'm just going to leave it there.